Good morning and welcome to today's Meet the Author event. We are thrilled to welcome Andrew Lawler, who is joining us from Scotland, where he's already researching his next book. But for today, he'll present his current book, Under Jerusalem, The Buried History of the World's Most Contested City. In Jerusalem, archaeology has sparked fascination and controversy since the 19th century. We're lucky to have Andrew illuminate that for us today. This program is co-sponsored by Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the support of the Addis Israel Sisterhood, as well as the Bethel Sisterhood, Library Committee, and Men's Club. And for this Israel program, we appreciate the additional sponsorship of Bethel's Am Yisrael Chai Committee. Many of you belong to Addis and Bethel, but many of you are from elsewhere. We welcome all of you. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Addis Israel. I also co-facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London. In tribute to Andrew's book, Marge and I have chosen Jerusalem backgrounds that are archaeology related. When you see Marge shortly, she'll be greeting you from the end of a recently unearthed monumental paved street that led to the Temple Mount. And as for me, I'm in front of a pile of massive stones, fallen remains from the Roman destruction of the Temple Mount in 70 CE. Before we travel to subterranean Jerusalem with Andrew, let me announce our summer online event. Geraldine Brooks, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, will visit us on Sunday, July 24th at 11. She will introduce her long-awaited new novel, Horse, which will be published in June. The book is already earning pre-publication buzz as a multifaceted look at America's legacy of enslavement and racism. The link to register for this Zoom event is in the chat box. If you register early, you'll automatically receive any bonus materials we send out in advance of the program. Now for today's program. Marge will introduce Andrew Lawler, then Andrew will present Under Jerusalem, and then we'll open up the program for Q&A. You can purchase Under Jerusalem from local independent bookstore Politics and Prose, as well as other booksellers. See the chat box for the Politics and Prose link and discount code. And Marge, please go ahead as soon as you are spotlighted. There you are.
She has to unmute.
So Marge, you have to unmute. Let's see if I can help with that. Let's see. We're probably both trying to do it at the same time. That's the problem.
Oh, maybe she can't. Oh, you know what? She can't do it. Oh, no. No, all right, do it now. Not so.
Okay, try now, Marge. No?
Just allow everybody to know. All right, that's all the trouble.
Okay, go ahead, Marge. See if you can unmute. Sorry about that.
There, I got it. Thank you. That said only you could do it. Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry about that. Technology is always our issue. It's a pleasure to introduce acclaimed author journalist Andrew Lawler. Under Jerusalem is Andrew's third book. Since its publication just a few months ago, it's been racking up enthusiastic reviews from prestigious publications. Under Jerusalem follows Andrew's national bestseller, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. His first book was Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The epic saga of the bird that powers civilization. I like his book titles, as well as his choice of subjects. Beyond his books as a journalist, Andrew has written about science, archaeology, politics, and history, and cultural heritage in more than 1,000 newspapers and magazine articles from more than 24 countries. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Scientific American, Smithsonian Magazine, and many others. He is also a contributing writer for Science Magazine and a contributing editor for Archaeology Magazine. On top of all that, Andrew's work has repeatedly been selected for inclusion in the anthology, The Best of Science and Nature Writing. Andrew grew up in Virginia, and his career in journalism began here in DC. So his visit today is coming home of sorts. When he's not traveling the world to research his next article or book, he lives in Asheville, North Carolina. We're beyond delighted to have him visit with us. As you listen to his presentation, if questions occur to you, you can raise your electronic hand at any time, and we'll turn to your questions when we reach the Q&A period. To raise your hand electronically, click on the button labeled Reactions, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. Then choose the option Raise Hand. Andrew, welcome. Feel free to begin as soon as you're spotlighted. We're all eager to hear about Under Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. You can hear me okay, I hope?
Yep.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. And although I'm a little embarrassed because it looks like Marge and Robin are in Jerusalem, and I just have my sad little messy office background here, but we'll just have to do. And don't worry, there'll be some more images of Jerusalem coming up. So first of all, I want to thank the synagogue, thank Marge, thank Robin for organizing this. It is really delightful to speak to a Washington-based group. As Marge mentioned, I lived there for many years. In fact, I think a member of your congregation, Courtney Stad, might be joining us from my past life as a space journalist, and somehow I ended up writing about archaeology. But that's enough about me, and let me share my screen, and we're going to take a little journey across the ocean to Jerusalem. There we go. Hope everybody can see the screen. Now, I want to give a shout out to Simon Norfolk, who is a National Geographic photographer who I worked with for a couple of years over in Jerusalem, and he kindly has allowed me to use a lot of the unpublished photos that he took while we were prowling around the old city. So here's one example. But I thought first we'd start out with the basics, because if you're geographically challenged like me, even if you've been to Jerusalem, you might need a little refresher. So we're going to start from space appropriately and then move in to the Middle East. You'll see Egypt on the left, that's the Nile River. To the right, you'll see Mesopotamia, or today's Iraq. There's the Dead Sea we're coming up on. And now, boom, the rugged Judean hills. And then, boom, we're right on top of Jerusalem. And the reason why I think it's good to remind ourselves of this, and by the way, that's the Dome of the Rock with the Golden Dome. That rectangular shape is the Temple Mount, what is known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. And that's kind of the center of the city and has been for thousands of years. But one reason why it's important to remember this geography is that it's a little puzzling that Jerusalem is so famous and so contested, because there's no port, there's no major artery, no road, no trade route. There's really not even much water there. Why in the world would Jerusalem be such an important city? Now, of course, the answer is religion. The answer is the beliefs of three major religions that, to a large extent, are centered on Jerusalem. Now, of course, the bottom left, you'll all recognize the Western Wall, which is the remnant of that platform that was built sometime between 2000 and 70 CE in various stages. Then to the right, of course, you have the Dome of the Rock, which is on top of the platform. That is the third holiest site in Islam. In fact, we're in the middle of Ramadan and Passover has just finished. And then up top, of course, you have the Holy Sepulchre, which is just a 10-minute walk away from both of these sites. And that's the traditional tomb of Christ. And you'll see it there filmed. Simon took this picture while perched at the very top of the dome of the Holy Sepulchre, something I would never, ever do, but I got a great shot of the candles that are being lit during the Easter celebration there. So, and this is, of course, an unusual month because it's rare to have the three major holidays of these three monotheistic religions happen at once, but indeed it is happening at once. And if you're reading the headlines, you know that things are very tense. There's been a lot of violence in Jerusalem in the past few weeks, and there's likely to be more. But we're going to turn to geography again. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, for those of you who have not been to Jerusalem, and if I were in an audience, I would ask you to raise your hands because it's always nice to see. But to the right, you'll see the old city surrounded by the wall, the medieval wall. And you could almost take the old city and drop it into the reservoir in Central Park. So all of the fuss, all of the contest around this city, it's about a very, very small place indeed. And one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that one thing that makes Jerusalem so unique, besides its obvious religious heritage, is its geology. And this helps explain why the underworld of Jerusalem is so extensive and important in the history of the city. Now, because it's built on limestone, limestone's porous. When water moves through it, it creates natural caves, as well as springs and underground rivers. So underneath Jerusalem is not just solid rock. It actually is pocked with both human as well as natural caves and tunnels and every kind of underground space you can possibly imagine. In fact, this is a good, gives you a good sense of the rugged terrain on which Jerusalem is built. You can see it's built on a series of hills, very, very steep hills indeed. And again, it's a very rugged territory. And because of that, there's not a lot of timber. Therefore, to build in Jerusalem, you needed to build with stone. And this is an important detail because building with stone requires building stone arches. And arches are very strong. They survive. They can survive earthquakes. They can survive enormous amounts of pressure. So as a result, beneath Jerusalem, you find not just the natural caves and quarries that were made by humans, but also these vast arches of previous structures that were built and then built on top of. And as a result, Jerusalem has these layers beneath, which are invisible to the eye, but which are very different from, say, a place like Athens or Rome. There really is this whole world that lies beneath the city of the ancient city. And I'll give you an example of this. So when I was living in the old city, I was living in the Christian quarter. And, I had to go get my groceries. There was a little grocery store that had good things nearby. And finally, after a few weeks of going in and out, the owner, Muslim owner, he said, who are you? Well, you're not a tourist. What are you doing here? And so I explained, and he laughed. And he walked over to the potato chip aisle. He lifted up a hatch in the floor. You see it there in your bottom left. And he disappeared down the hatch. So I put my groceries down. I climbed down the ladder with him. And we were in this enormous dark space. And we turned on our iPhone lights. The lights didn't penetrate all the way to the end. What we were in was a massive ancient crusader hall from the 13th or 14th centuries that had been recently discovered and dug out by Coptic monks. You see to your right, a Coptic monk that had accessed it from the Holy Sepulchre, which is right next door. And they'd secretly dug it out with the help of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which wanted to dig it out, but they didn't want to alert the Muslim shopkeeper above. And he only discovered what was going on when one morning he came in and he heard some noise. He opened up the hatch and there were several drunk Coptic monks having a little party in his basement. They had finished digging for the night and they had neglected to go inside to get out before the Muslim shop owner arrived. So it turned into a huge legal case. Actually, there was violence around it. It was a whole story. It was actually the first political crisis of a young prime minister who had just come to power named Benjamin Netanyahu. So you see, you don't have to go far in Jerusalem. And I don't mean these famous sites that we'll talk about in a moment. You don't have to go far to find a really fascinating story. I mean, this one little incident required a lot of digging myself and turned into a whole chapter of the book. So these are the kind of surprises that I found made Jerusalem particularly fascinating. Okay, now we're going to do a very, very quick little history lesson for those of you who fell asleep in history class, but it won't take long. So think of Jerusalem's past as three major segments. 5,000 years, three segments. The first is that period about which we don't know a lot, from 3000 BC, when cities are first getting built, to about 1000 BC, right around the time we believe that this tribe called the Israelites appear. They conquer Jerusalem, take it over, and then for the next 1,000 years, we have that period that most of us are familiar with, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, and that is this biblical millennium. This is this period where you have the Judeans living there, but also you have Assyrians and Babylonians and Greeks and Romans moving through the area. This is the time in which most of the Old Testament in Christian thought, or just the Bible for Jews, was written. So this is a very critical period. But we tend to forget that there's 2,000 more years of very interesting history that followed the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, which Robin mentioned earlier. And that included this period where the Romans came in and basically recreated the city. So the city you see today is based on that Roman model of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. And then, of course, you have Persian invaders, the Byzantines, who are essentially Romanized Christians, who turned it into a very large and important city in the Byzantine Empire. And then the Arabs arrive with Islam in the 7th century CE. And then, of course, the Crusaders come in, take it over. And then finally, around the time that Martin Luther is starting the Reformation in the 1500s, the Ottomans, who are an Islamic Turkic-speaking people, they move in and take it over from the Arabs. And from then until World War I, it remained under the control of the Ottoman Empire. There you go, Jerusalem's history in one slide. Now on to the main event. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened in starting the 1860s. And why this is important is that this is what I argue shaped the way we see Jerusalem today. Jerusalem was not a very traffic city. It wasn't a place that many people went to from the West, Jewish or Christian, until around the 1860s. And one of the things that sparked that change was this gentleman named Dzolzi. He was this very interesting artillery officer who married well and became the confidant to Napoleon III, who was the leader of the French Empire. Now, he wanted to dig at a place called the Tomb of the Kings, just outside of the old city. If you haven't been to the Tomb of the Kings, next time you visit Jerusalem, I highly recommend it. It's reopened after being closed for a number of years. Sensational tomb. And he managed to get permission from the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul to dig there in Jerusalem. So this is the first legal dig. And what he found was this sarcophagus that contained the remains of clearly a royal woman. Now, he declared, "Eureka, I have found the Queen of Hezekiah." How he came up with that, it's not exactly clear. He obviously wanted to believe that he had found something from the Bible, and it was displayed at the Louvre and made an incredible sensation. For the first time, you could go to a museum and you could see remnants from biblical times. This was big news back in the 1860s. Now, it also was big news that he had dug this tomb that many Jews in Jerusalem considered sacred. They said, "This is where our ancestors are buried. How dare you desecrate it?" So from the very first dig, you have this fascinating mix of religion and politics and science all coming together, and often in violent ways. Now, the next thing that happened was the British were not about to allow the French to get all this biblical treasure and put it in the Louvre. Heck no. So they set up their own fund, the Palestine Exploration Fund, in order to send archaeologists and geographers and geologists and what have you to explore beneath the city. And this rather rough bunch. Although if you look in the center of the picture there, you'll see the guy with the pith helmet. You know, he's obviously the Episcopal bishop in the group who didn't do a lot of digging. But they did an incredible job in searching beneath the city and mapping what was underneath. You know, the arches I mentioned, the passages, the tunnels that were very, very difficult to get to. Now, in doing this, Charles Warren, who's this gentleman up here, and I'll show you, give you a sense of what he dug. So when he started to explore tunnels like this one here, that actually at the time was filled with about 6 feet of sewage. And he had to actually pole in a boat down this thing to map it. So the conditions were quite terrible. This gives you a sense of the scale. That's the street above that you're looking at there. So these were enormous spaces that no one had really mapped or understood. So in order to access these areas, Warren, who's from the Palestine Exploration Fund, he did things like use gunpowder to blast his way through some of these tunnels that have been blocked. Now, he's doing this next to Islam's third holiest site, and a site that's holy to Jews as well. This did not endear him to the Jews or to the Muslims in Jerusalem, because they said, what's this crazy Christian doing? He's setting off explosive charges beneath our city, near our holy sites. And there was one family, the Abu Sauds, who actually sued unsuccessfully to try and claim damage from his efforts. And what this did was it created tension between the Ottoman rulers, who were controlling Jerusalem but want to play nice with the Europeans, because they need the European technology and money and railroads, etc., and the local Muslims, Arab Muslims, who really aren't happy that these foreigners are coming in and getting permission to dig in holy sites. So from the beginning, you know, these early days, you had this tension, which continues today. Now, in the 1890s, one of the big questions that archaeologists wanted to answer, and this is the period when, for the first time, you can really call it archaeology. Their scientific methods are beginning to provide good data about the past. Now, one of the questions was, where was the original Jerusalem? Not the old city, but the old city, the city that's mentioned in the biblical texts about the time of King David and Solomon. Solomon creating the United Kingdom, turning Jerusalem into this fantastic place. They had visitors like the Queen of Sheba who came. But the question was, where was it? Where were the remains of what was assumed to be a massive city? You can see at the bottom right there an image of what people thought the Tomb of Solomon looked like in the 19th century. So these guys, Bliss and Dickey, the top left, they began to dig, and I can't tell you which is which. They have the same droopy Victorian mustaches, but they began to dig tunnels in this area. If you see the pink area to the south, Mount Zion, didn't find anything that looks particularly old there. And then they started digging in this little tongue of land that sticks out south of the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif. And in fact, they did find pottery and other evidence that this looked like it was the oldest part of town. So this was likely the city of David that you see mentioned in the biblical text, but still there wasn't a lot that was discovered other than some broken pieces of pottery. No palaces, no remains of major buildings, no script, nothing like that, but enough evidence to at least give people an idea of where the most ancient part of Jerusalem was located. And this got a lot of publicity around the world, their dig. And as a result, you have this whole new crowd of people who decide that there is treasure to be found. Now, Raiders of the Lost Ark, we tend to think of that as a 1980s film, but actually this is the origin of the Raiders of the Lost Ark idea, the idea that you can find the Ark of the Covenant. This is not an ancient medieval idea. This is something that happened in the 1910s when this crazy British aristocrat named Montague Parker led this bizarre, I have to say, the most bizarre expedition ever to try and find treasure. I don't call them archaeologists because he hired psychics, he hired a steamboat captain from the Congo. I mean, he hired a cricket star, but he forgot to hire an archaeologist. But he had a lot of money. He had a lot of money from American and from British investors who were convinced that if he found the Ark of the Covenant and the other temple treasures that had been lost at the time of the Babylonian destruction of 586 BC, that he and all the investors would be very rich people indeed. Now, they dug and dug and dug for 2 years. They even brought in the person who designed the London Tube to design the tunnels to find these lost treasures. Of course, they found nothing except for a few pieces of pottery that weren't much interest to them. And so then they made a critical mistake. Parker was so desperate that he bribed the guard at the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, and managed to get in at night and whack away at the holiest stone in the world. That is the stone underneath the Dome of the Rock, which is revered by Muslims as a place where Muhammad went up to heaven for his heavenly journey, and by Jews as possibly the place that was at the center of the ancient temples, and possibly a place too where Jacob had his dream, the dream of the ladder. All kinds of legends attach themselves to this spot. So when he was discovered whacking away at this rock, naturally there was a riot. They managed to get out of town with their lives, but this created a huge upheaval. It almost overturned the entire Ottoman government. People were outraged that these foreigners had been allowed to attack this ancient site. So it really had a political aspect too, because the local Arabs said, well, we certainly can't depend on these Ottomans to protect our holy Islamic site. And this is, in a way, the beginning of this idea of an Arab Muslim nationalism. You know, this is a place that only they could protect. So this incident, which was comical in some ways, had a huge impact on what happened later in Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but what happened then was that European Jews had been reading about these discoveries being made by European Christian excavators. And finally, they said, wait a second, this is our cultural heritage. Why are we letting these Christians go after it? So Baron Edmund de Rothschild, he put together the first expedition of Jewish archaeologists to explore Jerusalem. They didn't find anything, but the idea was that there was something there to find that was very, very valuable. But World War I intervened. In the end, the British conquered Jerusalem from the Ottomans. And then, of course, during the 20s and 30s, you have fighting between the new Jewish immigrants as well as the local Arabs. And then by 1948, Israel is created, Britain withdraws, and Jerusalem is divided. And that's the way it stayed. There wasn't a lot of archaeology done until 1967. And that's when, of course, the Israelis sweep in and conquer Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, not just West Jerusalem, but also East Jerusalem, which had been under Jordanian control. So for the first time, you have Israeli Jews in charge of excavating, no longer British and French Christians. So this changed the way archaeology was done. And one of the great examples, I think, is Benjamin Mazar on the left, who found in his digs near the Temple Mount, found incredible remains from that period of around and before 70 CE. In fact, Robin showed you those giant boulders there behind her. So what was there previously, though, was this very classical city that Herod the Great had at least planned, if not built. And clearly, this was proof that Jerusalem in the first century BC and AD, as well as CE, was a very large and important Jewish city, no question. Which had political implications, because this is the time when Jewish politicians in Israel are arguing that, in fact, all of Jerusalem belongs to Israel, it's a Jewish city. Now, to the right is this gentleman, Meir Ben Dov, wonderful man I spent a lot of time with. And he was digging under Mazar's supervision when he found a whole nother side of Jerusalem that no one knew anything about. And that was these massive Islamic palaces built just at the point where the Islamic forces arrive in the 7th century CE. So not just the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, which you see there on the platform, but also these massive palaces, which showed that for the Muslims, the early Muslims, Jerusalem was extremely important, not just from a political point of view, but also from not just from a religious point of view, but from a political point of view. And why did this matter? 1,400-year-old palaces, it's nice, but who cares? Well, everybody cared. When Ben Dov went to one of his colleagues and told him what he'd found, his colleague, a respected Israeli archaeologist, said, "You got a bulldozer?" Ben Dov said, "Well, of course." He said, "Bulldoze it. We don't want anybody to know that there were Muslim palaces here." Now, Ben Dov, as a good archaeologist, of course, did no such thing. And he managed to put the news out about this to be sure that people had this fuller picture of Jerusalem's history. But I use that as an example of how what you find from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem has tremendous political implications today. Now, I'm going to go through this kind of fast, but you probably all have heard of the Western Wall Tunnel. What you may not know is that it began as a secret project by rabbis, not by archaeologists, who were going to dig essentially a prayer hall that stretched all the way down the length of the Western Wall, from the Western Wall Plaza north to the end of the Western Wall. And this was kind of a surprise because, hold on, and I'll give you a little image of some of the stones. These are the stones at the foundation of the Western Wall. It gives you an idea of the hugeness of the construction, and also of the amazing engineering project that this tunnel involved. Because to build this, they were building it underneath not just homes, but the Muslim quarter and some of the most ancient and medieval places in Jerusalem that are important for Muslims. So this was a very controversial project, and when it became known, it became something that Muslims, they thought, well, this is Charles Warren all over again, people digging underneath us again. So again, you have this repetition of Arab concerns about what is going on beneath their feet. Now, when they opened the exit to this tunnel in 1996, it was Benjamin Netanyahu again who did this when he first became prime minister. There was outrage, there were riots, there was violence, more than 100 people were killed, thousands of people were injured. And many historians say that it's clear that this was the beginning of the end for the Oslo peace talks. So the idea of creating a separate Palestine that could coexist with Israel began to fall apart at this point. So this is where even opening a door in Jerusalem can lead to bloodshed and chaos. And this is not something that happened 100 years ago. This was quite recent, and it had enormous implications for what is going on in Jerusalem today. And then in the 2000s, there was a push to go back to the city of David, because remember, I talked about that place being dug in the 1890s, and it was determined this is the city of David. But where were the palaces? Where were the temples? Where were the large buildings that were associated with the city of David? They still had not been found 100 years later. And this was a matter of some embarrassment to many Israelis who believed that this was the spot where, in a way, Judaism began, where you could trace the Israeli state back to the spot. Yet there was no archaeological evidence. Now, in 2005, Eilat Mizar, who unfortunately passed away last May, she found what she claimed to be the Palace of David. This got headlines all over the world. Now, the thing is that her dating is controversial. Whether or not this really is the palace is extremely unclear. In fact, most of her colleagues remain unconvinced. But nevertheless, it got into the headlines, and politicians and others began to use this as an example, as proof of the ancient Jewish connection to this site, which is also located in a primarily Muslim Arab neighborhood. So again, you have this kind of arcane argument within archaeology that has political implications right now. And this is a really fascinating example of politics, religion, and science coming together in one in Jerusalem. This is a massive tunnel beneath the city of David, or Wadi Hilwa is the Muslim name for this neighborhood. And it's exposing a street that went from the Pool of Siloam at the bottom of the hill all the way up to the Temple Mount in the 1st century. Now, When this was being dug, nobody really knew exactly when it had been built or who built it. People assumed it was Herod, right? Herod did all kinds of big things in the 1st century BCE. But instead, the archaeologists discovered these coins, which provided very precise dating. And the dating put it to the time of somebody who Christians despise as the man accused of crucifying Jesus, and Jews certainly don't like because he was seen as disrespecting Judaism. That's Pontius Pilate. It turns out that Pontius Pilate was clearly the person in charge of ensuring that this street, which went to the top of the Temple Mount to venerate, as a place for pilgrims to go up to the Temple Mount, was built by this allegedly terrible Roman ruler. So it gives us this other view of these kind of cardboard characters that come out of Jerusalem. That maybe Pontius Pilate was a more complicated character. Maybe he wanted to glorify Jerusalem, probably for his own reputation, but also it's a sign that he certainly was affected by the Jewish belief that this is an important site. So again, it's a very interesting find, which doesn't really fit in with some of our simple narratives. And I'm not going to go into detail about this. This is I did a story in the January issue of Archaeology Magazine about the Gavati parking lot, but suffice it to say that this very important dig that's happening just south of the Temple Mount has exposed a whole series of layers in Jerusalem that we had no idea about. We had no evidence from the Persian Hellenistic periods to speak of. Now we do. And it shows that Jerusalem was really tied into its neighbors. It wasn't an isolated place. In fact, it was a place where you could find objects with faces. You could find jewelry that had goddesses on it. It wasn't, the point is that Jerusalem was tied into the trade routes and to the culture of that region in a way that I think had not been fully understood in the past. And finally, this is something I learned that from the 1860s until today, some things in Jerusalem haven't changed. I mean, many things have. Who's running the city, who's living in the city. I mean, Jerusalem has changed hands so many times in the past 100 years, yet still there are these questions of Arabs complaining about their buildings, their foundations being damaged by digs taking place below. You still have patrons who have political and religious agendas, whether they're Christian or Jewish, who are digging beneath the city and who are funding these efforts. And that affects how the results are portrayed. And this conflict over scientific data is not just between scientists, it's also between politicians who argue that it proves, say, for example, that Jews were there in 3000 BC or 2000 BC, whereas Arabs might say, no, there's no this proof, it's not proof at all. So you have these arguments that are really about today and in a way less about what happened in the past. And then these issues of whether these excavations in East Jerusalem are legal at all. Now, of course, the Israelis maintain that they are legal because they take place in a city that has been a part of the city that's been annexed to Israel. But most of the world says, no, this is occupied territory. And we have all kinds of international agreements which forbid digging in occupied territory. So it's a clear violation of that. So again, you've got these arguments over who is digging and why they're digging and whether they can dig at all. And so finally, we'll get to some questions. Just wanted to throw out what I uncovered that I found particularly surprising about my time in Jerusalem was that, first of all, it was Christians, not Jews and not Muslims, who really began this whole thing. And when I say this whole thing, I mean, they began the fight to control Jerusalem. Certainly Jerusalem was fought over for millennia, but in the modern world, what happened was Christians wanted to control Jerusalem and therefore the Ottoman Empire. And that became a model that was then picked up by others. So to me, it's kind of fascinating that Christians who tend to kind of take a back seat in this debate about Jerusalem actually are in a way the instigators of a lot of what has happened in the past 150 years. Secondly, the biblical millennium is still the focus. The bottom right, you'll see a toilet that was recently found. Okay, an ancient toilet, great, happens all the time. We find them. But this was found in Jerusalem, so it made international headlines. So again, it shows you that it shows you the power of that particular period in Jerusalem's history, which is associated with the Bible, that still gets people excited. They want to contribute money to that. They want to argue about the fines, but it also means that these other parts of Jerusalem's history tend to get short shrift. And then finally, because I'm American, I tend to have something of an optimistic view. I want to find some optimistic conclusion. And the best I can do here is to say that the science that is being done in Jerusalem does provide us, as difficult as it is to do the science, as controversial as it is, as difficult it is to sort through the politics versus the actual data. Nevertheless, we can get glimpses of a Jerusalem that is way more complicated than any of our simple narratives, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian, something that goes beyond that simplified view of the city, which I think can give us a richer and fuller picture of the place. And then maybe that will help us to sometime, resolve the difficult issues that face the city today. So thank you very much. And I know that was a lot, but I'm eager to take some questions. And I just want to thank National Geographic for all their support, photographer Simon Norfolk, and of course, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which was very generous in allowing me to visit their sites and answer 10 million questions. And now it's time for me to answer your questions.
So Andrew, thank you so much. That was a fabulous introduction to underground Jerusalem. To learn more about underground Jerusalem, you'll want to read Andrew's exceptionally informative and enthralling book. He chooses great research topics, he thoroughly investigates them, and then shares his findings in a adventure story format. So he has a gift for narrative nonfiction, and you definitely will be happy if you read this book. So again, the link to purchase copies of the book is in the chat. And if you have a question for Andrew, you can raise your hand electronically, as Marge mentioned. And to do that, click on the button labeled reactions, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. Then choose the option raised hand. You will not be recorded. The recording will stop after I ask a question or two, which I will do now, just to get us started. So Andrew, so other people will ask you about the book. So I'll ask you about the lead up to the book, because I gather you've been reporting on archaeology for a number of years from many different locations. And could you say something about that and how that maybe led you to Jerusalem and this book?
Well, actually, I was dragged kicking and screaming to Jerusalem because, having written about the Middle East for 20 years, I've covered stories in Iraq and Iran and Syria and other places. I really steered clear of Jerusalem because of the politics and religion and science that were all kind of mixed up together. And then I guess I got a tour. I had a tour about 4 or 5 years ago by a distinguished Israeli archaeologist who showed me what was underground, and I was blown away. And I realized that actually this is what makes Jerusalem so interesting, is that there's no other place in the world that combines the politics and religion and science in such an intense and immediate way. So I suddenly realized that this is exactly where I want to go, even though another part of me thought, oh, don't write about Jerusalem. It'll only lead to trouble. But I haven't looked back since.